Okay, so now we are going to be looking at the presentation having to do with the industrial workers, which is section 3. And uh, this is going to be important that we know this is the third part that we need to have uh, knowledge of for our chapter test. And so let's go ahead and begin with that. And people taking notes on this one, on this page, all you have to do and here is to write down, and you want to put it in bubble form if you want, or just in words, job specialization plus mechanization equals money, lots of money. So at the top of this screen, you notice it says profits more important than everything else. That's profits means the money you make, right? After you've paid your bills and everything, what are the profits? And so the profits really were the most important thing for these big businessmen, how much money they were making. And so the key they found out was job specialization and mechanization could make them a lot more money. So that's all you have to write down. And what we're going to do is on the next slides, we're going to talk about what job specialization and mechanization is. All right. So if you've written that down, let's go ahead and talk about that. Because when I say that this was more important than anything else, it means it was more important than safety and the workers' happiness, things of that nature. So, what's specialization? Specialization, let's go ahead and write everything that you see under the word specialization of jobs. Specialization is best understood. Look at this picture here. I tell you what, stop for a moment and look at this picture. This picture is probably not specialization. Not. What's happening here is you see each of these women are sewing. This is in the textile industry. It means the clothing where you're making fabric and where you're putting that fabric together to make clothing is textile industry. And these women probably are highly skilled workers. And they're more than likely, whatever they're working on, they're making every part of that garment. If they're working on some kind of fancy dress, they're putting everything in the hems, the lace, the collar, the top part of it, the bottom part of it, everything. And it takes a lot of these skilled people to get the job done. Because if you notice, they're not working with machines. That's what happens before specialization. So now go ahead and write specialization and go ahead and write that down. That's on the right there. Because what happens with specialization is people aren't doing all of the parts. Remember we talked about Henry Ford and the assembly line? Those people they didn't all have to know how to put the entire car together, did they? Maybe they only knew how to, one person maybe only put on the wheels and they put on the wheels of the next one. They put on the wheels of the next one until, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? That's all I'm doing is putting on wheels of this car. Same small task over and over again. I don't know about you, but that sounds kind of boring. And do you have to be highly skilled for specialization like that? No, you do not. So you don't have to be a skilled worker that you have to pay more money for. Because usually when people know a lot more, they get paid more, right? So these workers kept doing the same task over and over, becoming tired and bored. And because there were machines, if they're bored and they're putting their hands around machines, they may end up being injured. So that was a big problem. So that's what specialization is about. Now I'm going to go to the next screen and take a look at this picture first. This is mechanization. The root word is mechanics. Mechanization has to do with machines. So go ahead and write that down. I forgot the blue arrow. You only need to write down where it says mechanization, machines run by unskilled workers and children. eliminated the jobs of skilled craftspeople. Write that down. So in the last picture, you see lots of skilled craftspeople. Now you see machines, you see one person. Now they're not doing the same job. They're not making clothes, but you get the idea. So these are unskilled workers, and in this case, that may even be a child that's in that picture. Don't know. But you don't need, with these machines and people doing one small boring part, you don't need all those skilled people. You can hire unskilled workers. Let me go back to that first picture again so you can see. All the people, they're all skilled. They're probably happier, even though they're all sitting there. It may look kind of boring to you, but that's much more interesting and satisfying and probably paying more than what's going on in this picture. So let's put it all together in this next slide. I put an X through it and it makes it harder to see, but you get the idea. This one is two pictures of textile, of people making fabric, making material. Look in the left picture with the X. There's four women in there, and they're probably, I'm going to guess, maybe enjoying their job. They're not too bored. They know how to do all the different parts of making whatever they're doing. They're probably making threads and yarn, things of that nature. There on the right-hand side, you see,
Mr. Thompson?
yes,
I was
yes,
trying to write down the end of the last slide.
uh-huh. I'll go back to it real quickly. Hold on. Let me finish this. Remember, this is in your folder now too. You'll be able to access it. But look at this picture on the right. You see all the machines. It's a row of machines. They're able to make so much more than those four women on the right. I mean, on the left. These machines are cranking out the fabric. And if you'll notice, they can't be highly skilled workers, or I wouldn't think so, because it looks like the one closest to us looks like a girl. Could be the age of a sixth grader. Could be. We don't know for sure, but you see a lot of jobs that you don't need nearly as many people. So when we're talking about big business and specialization and mechanization equals dollars, you see that? Making so much more with so many fewer employees, and the ones that you are paying, you're not having to pay as much because they're unskilled. I'm going to go back to that last slide real quickly. Mechanization, machines run by unskilled workers and children, eliminated, that means got rid of, the jobs of skilled craftspeople. And we can see it now, especially in this picture on the right. Okay, now, this guy right here, I don't guess he meant to be a bad guy. Maybe he's not even a bad guy at all, but he sure caused a lot of harm. This guy is Frederick W Taylor, and he's the one who researched and figured out that if factory owners would view workers as interchangeable parts, meaning only have them do a small part here, and it's an easy job and they just sit there and they can do that. And if you need them, then you can quickly move them over here and they're doing this. And if you need somebody over there, go put them over there, because it's not hard to do any of these jobs. So you can just move them wherever you want. It's not like those women that knew how to do everything on those dresses or making that material. They're interchangeable parts. So he wrote this book called The Principles of Scientific Management, Frederick W. Taylor. And he's the one that in this book convinced people that if they did this with machines and unskilled workers, using them as interchangeable parts, then they could make lots more money if they didn't have to have all these skilled workers. He was right. But the harm that it caused, the unhappiness, the boredom, uh, caused the people in factories to get rich if they own the factories, but everybody else was probably suffering as a result of Mr. Taylor. So he was very influential. When his book came out, all these business leaders, they were reading his book. They wanted to know how they could make more money, and boy, they did. So you do need to know about him. He's an important name in this chapter. Frederick W. Taylor. Boo. So I've talked about the workers and they're unhappy. What are they going to do about it? What can they do? They're just one little person against the rich guy. Well, what somebody figured out was, well, if I go, I don't have a chance. If you go by yourself, you don't have a chance. And if she goes, then by herself, she doesn't have a chance. But what if we all go together? What if we all form a group called a labor union? Labor means work. Union means a group, basically. What if we form a labor union and we all together work to try to get things changed? So they formed labor unions. And three of their important goals were as follows. So on this page, go ahead and write everything down. This is all important. These workers, no, not the big guys, not the bosses, absolutely not. But the employees formed labor unions. And at that time, workers had to work like 11, sometimes 12-hour days. And they didn't make a whole lot of money, barely enough to feed their family sometimes. Not all the time, but they worked very long hours and on Saturdays too. So it's 6 days a week, not 5 days a week. Um, if you notice from that picture, we had mentioned children. Look at that picture while you're writing. If you get a chance, glance over there. This machine obviously needs an adult to operate it because there's stuff going on at the top of it you have to be able to reach. These children aren't tall enough. They're having to stand on part of the machine below. This is what we're talking about, dangerous work conditions. These children are working in a job they shouldn't be doing, and don't you see how they could get injured? Anybody could get injured standing on the machine. And look closely. You see they're barefooted inside a workplace and they are barefooted on top of a machine. So if you are bored and you're a bored child on top of a machine, I would imagine, and I know this is a fact, that people died. We're not talking about an accident like somebody scratching their arm or something. We're talking about getting arms caught in a machine, and next thing you know, you're going through it and you're dead. So those three bullets there, these are the three goals that were so important to a lot of folks. Shorten the work days. People wanted to work only 8-hour days. Make sure everyone doing the same job got equal pay. So if two people are standing by this machine and doing the same thing, shouldn't they get the same pay? That wasn't the case at first. That was not how it happened. It could be maybe they just liked somebody more, so they gave them a lot more money than the other person. That's not fair. And then they wanted to stop children from having to work in the factories. A lot of times these were poor children. They were from poor families, and maybe they needed the money. Maybe their family really did need the money. But having them work in factories instead of going to school didn't sound good. All right, so we're going to move to the next slide. Now, don't write anything yet, please. I want to make sure we understand what collective bargaining, just what the two words mean. Don't write yet. I know that some of you like to collect things. It could be you collect baseball cards, or you collect dolls, or you collect coins or stamps, whatever. Hear that word collect? You're bringing these things you collect together into a collection. It simply just means that it's not just one person, it's a collection of people coming together, and they're coming together as a collection so they can bargain with the bosses of the company so that they can try to talk to them. And you know the word negotiate? Negotiate means you're trying to get your way. So that you're trying to bargain to get things changed. As a collection of people, you're trying to do that. Okay, so collective bargaining. Everything we're going over are things, I've narrowed it down to everything on this slide that I'm telling you you need to know. It will be on this test next Wednesday or Thursday. So go ahead and write this paragraph down. Collective bargaining, the belief that workers collecting together, right, acting together, have greater success in negotiating or bargaining with management than when acting alone. The belief that workers acting together have greater success in negotiating or bargaining with management than when acting alone. And I would imagine that's true today in almost all instances. All right. And you see people with these signs. When you have a sign like that and you're trying to get something changed and that's on what's written on the sign, that's called picketing. You walk in front of a building or a store or whatever it might be, and you've got those signs and you're trying to get that message out, that's called picketing. I'm explaining that term because you'll see it a little bit later, maybe in the next slide. Okay, here we go with the next slide. Okay, you do need to write down exactly where these blue arrows are pointing. This is information that I know is right on the test. I'm sorry that on the right-hand side, one of the arrows is messed up. It needs to be a little bit lower, that last arrow on the right, so that it points. Here's what this slide is about. At the time that we're talking about, two big unions, I mean, they were in the whole United States, for the whole United States. These are the two big unions that were helping workers out. That these are the two that were formed. And you need to know the names of them. That's what's in yellow at the top. Knights of Labor is one union. The American Federation of Labor is another one. And they were different. You need to know their leaders, and we will talk about that a little bit more next week. But the leader of Knights of Labor was Terence Powderly. The leader of the American Federation of Labor on the right-hand side was Samuel Gompers. Now, it seems like, well, they're just two unions, big deal. Why do I need to know what one was, or they probably about the same? Actually, they were different in some important ways. As you're writing, do you see under Knights of Labor, the third bullet, it says they represented and tried to help skilled and unskilled workers. They tried to help skilled and unskilled workers get changes made. And the reason that's important, and I didn't ask you to write this down, but look at the last bullet. Their goals were equal pay for equal work, to end child labor, and to have an 8-hour workday. One of those has to do with unskilled workers, children. Children are not, they're not usually skilled workers. So they really wanted to, they're the union that was trying to get child labor ended because they're helping unskilled workers, and children are those unskilled workers. Okay, so that's a big difference because when you look on the other side, the American Federation of Labor, They were for skilled workers only. Skilled workers only. Like, for instance, people working in a mine workers. I've listed a couple of examples, mine workers and steel workers. People who work in mines, they have to be skilled workers or they could be losing their life and their coworkers' lives very quickly. They've got to know how to go down into a mine and know about different types of minerals, where to strike and hit so that there's not a cave in. They got to know about oxygen levels so that they know when it's safe to breathe and whether maybe they've gone too deep in an area that's got some dangerous gases. There's all kinds of things that make them skilled workers. So the American Federation of Labor was for skilled workers, and it was divided into different types of job categories. So it was really like separate unions rolled up into one big union. So they may have the mine workers, the steel workers. I don't know if they existed, but one maybe for railroad workers, one for oil drilling drillers. Um, so anyhow, that's the big difference there. So when you look at what their goals were, that's the last bullet. I didn't ask you to write it down. They were looking for their changes were had to do with rights. The right to picket. That means like holding those signs that we saw in another picture. The right to picket. The right to organize boycotts. That's when, like, if a company's done something you don't like, and so you tell everybody, we're not going to buy their product. We don't like that. Stop buying it. And so, maybe with the idea there with the boycott is, if you stop buying their stuff, maybe they'll change what they're doing wrong, and or maybe they'll stop what you don't like, and you'll get your way with a boycott. And so then they change it. Okay, if you change your what you're doing, we'll start buying your products again. So that's how a boycott works. A strike is something completely different. That's where everybody in a factory decides they're going to quit their job, quit working until a change is made. They're not quitting. They're not quitting their job and like leaving their job and going to go work somewhere else. I mean, when they're striking, they're maybe having the picket signs out front and they're refusing to work until they get their changes made. And with a strike, it's not just a couple people, it's all the people that are working in that factory or in that job. Okay? So that's not on the test what picket organizing boycotts or strikes, what the definitions of those are, but you do need to know those, particularly a strike, because we're going to be talking about that next. All right, do we have everybody with those 6 bullets copied?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good.
Yes, sir.
All right. I hope everybody's also understanding this. I'm trying to go a little quickly because I'm not sure how much time we need. There's going to be one or two more screens with slides with a, a good bit of copying. So I'm trying to make sure we finish. Does everybody understand what I just said about the 2 labor unions? Y'all got that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You really do need to memorize that. We'll be working on memorizing it. Knights of Labor with Terrence Powderly, and they're trying to help skilled and unskilled, including getting children out. And on the other hand, the American Federation of Labor with Samuel Gompers is helping the skilled workers only and helping with their rights. Now, you don't have to copy anything on this. You do not need to, but I'm going to use this to reinforce what we just talked about. You see the Knights of everybody, I'm sure you had Venn diagrams in elementary school. I would be shocked if you didn't. So Knights of Labor is on one side, and you remember that if it's on that one side, that means that's how it's different than the thing on the other side. So I know I'm repeating, but it's important. Knights of Labor, they were the first labor union in the entire country. It means that it went all across the whole country. They were the first one. It wasn't just for skilled laborers, it was for skilled and unskilled. Their top job was to end one of their top ones was to end child labor, and it's smaller. It's smaller than the AFL. So on the other side, what makes the American Federation of Labor different is that it was actually one big labor union that was made up of other small national unions, one for each type of job, only for skilled workers. They were very much interested in the right to picket, boycott, and strike, and it's larger than the Knights of Labor. So, what do they have in common? There in the middle of the Venn diagram, it says that they were both interested in better wages. Um, we know that wages means the amount of money that people make. Better wages, better pay is what it really means. Better hours. They wanted to reduce the hours to these bad hours. They didn't want to work 11-hour days. They wanted 8-hour days, and they wanted better, safer, healthy work conditions, not dangerous work conditions. Okay, so we move on to this. You'll need to go ahead and write this down. Uh, for unions, Frederick Taylor was the enemy because he didn't think workers, it seemed like he didn't think workers were all that important. You can just use them just for these little things. Who cares if they're getting bored? We're talking about these little things where you can move them in wherever you would like. So Gompers and Powderly, remember, those are the people, the presidents of the unions. They fought against Frederick W. Taylor's negative view of workers. The absolutely beautiful lady there on the right is Miss Mary Jones. I don't mean to make fun of her, but people were so serious when they took pictures back then. I'm sure if she was alive today, she would have dressed very differently and she would have posed very differently. But I just wanted to bring it to your attention that they always look so serious. But anyhow, Miss Jones was a wonderful person who worked for labor unions, but one in particular. She worked to help the working conditions of miners. Even today, working in a mine is a very dangerous job. So you can imagine that working back then, uh, it would have been even more dangerous, much more dangerous. So Mary Harris Jones is another name. You need to know all the names that we've talked about today. Frederick Taylor, Gompers, and Powderly, and now Mary Harris Jones. All four of these names um, will be on the test. I know that for a fact that those names are going to be on that test. Or you have to know them. Maybe I should say that because I might have a question on the test where the answer is Powderly, and you got to know it's not Gompers, it's Powderly, right? So you have to be familiar with them. All right, so we're going to move on to the next slide. And the next slide has a lot of writing on it, but you don't write any of it. You're just going to listen to me talk about this. Don't write anything. This slide has a lot of information on it. And once I finish talking about it, you pay attention. And when we get to the next slide, which has a pretty decent amount of writing on it, you'll understand everything you've written. Okay. So what this is about is that during this time period, once these labor unions really got started, do you think that they just instantly got their way just because they came as a group? Do you think these big businessmen said, "Oh, we didn't know that," and they just changed everything at once? The answer is no. They didn't. They didn't. So then they had to figure out, okay, so now what do we do? There may have been some instances where some of them changed, But in most instances, they had to figure out, okay, now we got to stand together. And in many instances, especially in these three particular columns, we're talking about three very famous strikes. Strikes means they refused to keep working in hopes that they would get their way. And these are very famous strikes. You will need to know all three. Don't worry, it's all on the next slide for you to copy. So let's talk about them. And I'm going to go first with the left-hand column. In Chicago, a lot of people began a strike because they wanted an 8-hour day. They went on strike from different jobs. It wasn't just like the people working in a steel mill or something like that. It was people all over Chicago that were in unions. They decided they were going to go on strike. And when they were striking, two strikers were shot and killed by policemen while they were striking. In response, the crowd went pretty crazy. And in the next night, while these strikers were gathering, somebody brought a bomb. Yeah, brought a bomb and and threw it at the policeman because they were mad that the policeman had killed two strikers. So they threw a bomb at the policeman and killed eight. When it says there are eight people, it's eight policemen and injured many, many others, very serious injuries. So then, well, the police, after they've been thrown a bomb at, you can imagine they took their guns and they started firing. It's crazy. It's almost like a war in the streets of Chicago. And so then they end up killing several people. And if you'll notice, it says, and they wounded over 100 more. So in a matter of 2 days, Chicago was just crazy with what was going on. I know y'all probably seen stuff recently in the news about people protesting. I'm sure if you've watched news at all, you've heard that in the last couple of months. This was in Chicago back in the 1880s. So this country has had problems in the past. Now that's just one strike. What you need to know is it's called the Haymarket Riot. The reason it's called Haymarket Riot is because there's a certain square, a certain area in Chicago called Haymarket Square. So the riot happened where people were piling into Haymarket Square in Chicago. Okay, the second riot, I haven't told you the name of Carnegie's steel mill, his factory in Pennsylvania, but it was called Homestead Steel Factory. You can't tell by the name of it, it's Carnegie's, but it's Carnegie's. Trust me. And he is in power, he is in control. So in this instance, the he Carnegie and his staff wanted to bring in more, better, bigger machines that to do the job that would end up replacing some of the workers. They weren't going to need as many workers. That means they were going to fire, literally get rid of the jobs of a number of people. Well, the union didn't like that at all. They didn't want anybody to lose their jobs. So in the Homestead strike, Homestead strike, it takes place in Carnegie's Homestead factory, right? Well, when they announced that they were going to be laying off people because of these machines coming in, not laying off, firing people, getting rid of their jobs, next thing you know, there's gunfire breaks out in the factory and 16 people are killed, more than in the Chicago, in the Haymarket riot. So in the Homestead strike, if you'll notice in the last paragraph there, it took 4 months for the crazy chaos to come to an end. So this was a very dangerous, long and drawn out strike, the Homestead strike. So these are three famous strikes in American history. In the third one, there's a company that makes Pullman cars. What that means is they're Pullman railroad cars. They make the passenger cars that people sit in, and they probably also make the other cars that are used too. But anyhow, they times were getting tough, and they really did need to pull back to keep in business. They needed less workers. So they laid off some workers. That means they said, we don't need you right now, but hang around. You probably get your job back. That's what laying off somebody means. The others that were working, they cut their pay. Okay, well, get this. At the Pullman company already had houses that were there right there near the factory that people lived in. The workers lived in those. They didn't live in them for free. The factory charged them rent. I don't know how much it was a month, but they charged them to live in those places. Well, when they announced that they were going to be laying off people and cutting their pay, wouldn't you think they would realize, well, you know what? They can't pay the rent now, or maybe they can't pay as much. We need to cut the rent some. Well, they didn't. They said, we still want all the money we deserve for our houses. You still got to pay that even though you don't have your job right now. Well, people obviously, you can understand, they were extremely upset. So they went on the Pullman strike. It was the Pullman coach company, the car company, the one that made the trains. So it's called the Pullman strike. And they ended up blocking railroad lines and trying to stop the trains from running. It went crazy. Federal court judges got involved, and eventually President Cleveland, he was the president at the time, he called out, it was by a different name then, but it's basically the National Guard. He called out troops, armed U.S. troops, to come into Cleveland, not Cleveland, to come into Illinois to put to finally end this riot, this strike. So these are very important. So what we're going to do now that I've kind of explained these, hopefully in depth, to where you can kind of get an understanding of how serious, how violent these strikes were, I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide, and you will copy everything on that slide. It's our last slide, okay? But go ahead and copy everything so that it looks like this. And I hope that with my explanation, it'll make sense of what you're looking at while you copy this down. You will need you will need to know all three of these strikes for next week's test. So if I say this riot occurred in Chicago, you would need to know it was the Haymarket riot. I'm saying this is as an example, right? Or this is the strike that happened at the steel plant in Pennsylvania, where strike breakers were brought in. Oh, I forgot to mention that. Um, in case it's on the test. On the Homestead strike, what got people so upset when Carnegie said he was going to replace people with machines in some parts of the factory? They went on strike. The whole plant, all the people went on strike, and he decided, okay, you're going to go on strike, then you're fired, and I'm bringing people in to replace you. Well, that's what really set things off there. I forgot to mention that strike breakers Strike breakers are people who are brought in to replace people who may have gone on strike. That really upset them then. They thought that was really unfair that suddenly they were replaced. So that's a very important thing having to do with the homestead strike. When you get down to the end and you're looking at the Pullman strike, and it says Pullman cut jobs and didn't help the fired workers out, what it means by didn't help them out is didn't help them out with the rent they were supposed to be paying for their houses. All right. So how are we doing? Good. All right. So we really I know you're still working on it, and we've got probably about 5 minutes of class, so you'll have time to finish this. We're going to finish just in time, I think. We're gonna make it. And the people who are listening in on this recording, I will try to stop this because we are finished with any new material that I'm going to be presenting. Whoops. Sorry, I'm having to slide this down to get to something else. And we are finished with the recording.